They say silence is a weapon sharper than any blade. In the vaults beneath the Imperium's oldest cathedrals, where incense burns thick and the stone remembers screams older than empires, there walk those whose very presence is a wound in reality. The Sisters of Silence, the Null Maidens, the Emperor's voiceless daughters. To stand before one is to feel your soul stripped raw, to hear the echo of your own thoughts retreating into panic. To the untrained mind, their mere existence is agony. To the psyker, it is oblivion. Yet, even among the endless tragedies of the 41st millennium, their story is perhaps the cruelest. A life defined not by faith or rebellion, but by the absence of both. Born cursed, sworn to silence, they serve a master they can never hear, and a galaxy that fears them more than it ever could love them. But what is it to live without a soul's voice? What remains of humanity when all warmth, all communion, all shared thought is burned away by the cold vacuum of the null field? In the grim dark of the far future, where there is only war, the Sisters of Silence are neither saviors nor monsters. They are necessity. They are the Emperor's blade turned inward, and their silence eternal. The void of her birth was not marked by cries or by prayer. It was as though the universe itself recoiled from her arrival. On the manufactorum world of Carthus V, where the air tasted of iron and promethium, a midwife dropped her scalpel as the newborn drew breath, or tried to. No sound came. The wailing that should have echoed against steel walls never came. The infant's eyes were open, unfocused, and the candles in the shrine guttered out as if strangled by unseen hands. Somewhere in the distance, a servitor froze mid-motion, its vox grill stuttering into static before falling quiet. It was then, they say, that the midwife began to weep. Not from fear, but from the sudden awareness that she could no longer feel the warmth of her own soul. They did not keep the child. No one ever does. Her name was never written in the Hab records, only marked by a data slate entry, an anonymous classification, a genetic anomaly, a red sigil denoting pariah. In the lower hive levels, whispers spread faster than the rot that ate through the piping. They said she drew nightmares to her, that to look into her eyes was to feel one's faith unravel. When the Scola Progenium inspectors came, their retinues of black-armored agents cleared the district with flame and decree. The girl was taken without word, sealed in a stasis capsule, ferried through the warp under escort of the black ships, those dreaded vessels that carried psykers to Terra's pyres. Yet she was not like them. She did not burn with psychic light. She devoured it. When she awoke, it was aboard the Lex Anima, one of the Emperor's own psychic harvesters. The air was heavy with incense and the low thrum of the Geller field. She remembered only fragments, the hum of machinery, the echo of prayers muttered by voices that refused to approach. Through the narrow slit of her holding cell, she watched as lines of condemned psykers shuffled past, their faces hollow, their tongues stilled by fear or devotion. They, too, felt her, the nullness that surrounded her like a shroud. Some screamed without sound, blood leaking from their eyes. Others simply collapsed, lifeless, as if their souls had been snuffed out like candles in a storm. The handlers did not speak to her. They used gestures, picked cards, mechanical servitors that slid trays of nutrient paste through hatches. Her only companion was the silence, vast and unending. She began to listen to it as others might listen to a heartbeat. The way the ship's hum seemed to falter near her chamber, the way the Emperor's name, when spoken in distant prayer, lost all resonance in her presence. She wondered, if only in faint thought, whether the Emperor himself could sense her, whether his divine light dimmed when it passed over her soul. Weeks became months. The black ship crossed the void, feeding upon the warp-tide currents that it both defied and feared. Outside, the stars bled crimson in the Empyrean winds. Inside, the child, aged in silence, neither comforted nor condemned, until the Lex Anima reached Terra. When the hatches opened, the light that spilled in was not divine. It was pale, filtered through the polluted sky of the Imperial cradle world. She saw the towers first, endless monoliths of adamantine rising from oceans of dust. The Imperial Palace loomed above all, a silhouette vast enough to eclipse faith itself. The child was led through labyrinthine corridors of brass and marble. Statues of the Emperor watched her passage, their sculpted eyes seeming to avert themselves from her presence. She passed acolytes, priests, custodian guards in gilded armor, all keeping their distance. When they spoke her classification aloud, even their voices trembled. Null. She was given a designation, a sigil burned into her forearm, and transferred to a cloister deep beneath the palace's shadow, the initiation vault of the Silent Orders. Here, the silence was different. It was structured, almost sacred. The air vibrated with absence. Rows of women, bald-headed and robed in gray, moved with ritual precision. Their eyes were calm, their faces expressionless. One approached, tall, severe, the faint scars of age tracing her temples. She looked upon the child not with disgust but recognition. Her gestures were slow, deliberate, the sign language of the sisterhood. Welcome home. That was the first kindness the girl had ever known. In the weeks that followed, she learned not through sound but through motion. Each lesson was wordless. The sisterhood taught her the language of silence, a graceful, exacting code of hands and eyes. They trained her body to move without hesitation, to breathe in rhythm with the sacred stillness. They burned away her name, for names were remnants of attachment, and attachment was weakness. In its place she was given a vow, a creed inscribed not in ink but in flesh, to serve the Emperor as his blade of silence, his shield against the psychic storm. Yet she did not yet understand what she was. The sisters called her Lyra Vane, a name of function more than affection, drawn from the roster of the Order of the Veiled Blade. To her, it meant only survival. But deep within her something pulsed, a faint echo of the life she'd lost, or perhaps a memory that was never hers to begin with. When she closed her eyes, she could almost hear it, the sound of someone breathing beside her, whispering a name she could not recall. A sound that should not exist in the perfect quiet, and it terrified her. She clung to that fragment of fear. It reminded her that she was still human. As the years passed, the world outside faded into myth. The training halls were her universe, the soundless prayers, her heartbeat. The Null Maidens lived without comfort, without music, without laughter. The Emperor was their only purpose, a being of light they could never feel. For Lyra, that contradiction was both her curse and her faith. She was made to serve the divine by embodying its absence. Every lesson, every silent drill, every wordless night of meditation reinforced that truth. One evening, as the twin moons of Terra hung low and red through the stained glass of the cloister, Lyra found herself staring at her reflection in a fragment of polished steel. Her eyes looked back, not hollow, but impossibly still. Around her, the other sisters prayed in gestures, their hands moving in unison. She imitated them, though the meaning still eluded her. Above the altar burned the symbol of the Imperial Aquila, wings spread wide, gaze fixed upon eternity. She wondered whether the Emperor, seated upon his golden throne, could see her through all that distance and machinery, and if he could, whether he chose to. The silence offered no answer. It never did. The years blended together like the unending hum of a reactor core, steady and without mercy. Lyra grew taller, leaner, her movements precise as clockwork. Around her, the cloister thrived in quiet obedience, a place without laughter, without anger, without song. The air was always heavy with incense and cold oil. The Sisters of the Order of the Veiled Blade spoke only through motion, their gestures a language older than words, born of the necessity to exist unseen and unheard. Each day began before dawn, when the temple's lumen lamps flickered into life. The sisters would rise, cleanse their chambers with ashes, and assemble in formation beneath the bronze statue of the Emperor Triumphant. He loomed over them like a god carved from judgment itself. In that silence, Lyra found both peace and torment. Peace, because the absence of sound meant the absence of fear. Torment, because within that absence, her thoughts became deafening. During meditation, she often felt the presence of others, not the sisters but echoes, like faint whispers bleeding through the walls of her mind. They came and went, flickers of terror, despair, longing. She would open her eyes, expecting to find some psyker intruding, but the chamber would be empty. It took her months to understand. Those were not her thoughts, but the dying reverberations of nearby souls recoiling from her null field. Her existence was a wound, and the galaxy bled around it. The tutors of the sisterhood never softened their hands. Their lessons were delivered through pain, precision, and endurance. In the training halls, marble floors bore the stains of centuries of blood. Servitors in crimson robes carried shock staves to correct hesitation. Pain reminds you of your flesh, the abbess once signed to Lyra during an early drill, her gauntleted hand moving with ruthless grace. You are more than flesh. You are the Emperor's will made silent. Lyra did not argue. She did not know how to argue. Words were a luxury the Emperor's chosen did not require. Sometimes, when exhaustion blurred the edges of her sight, Lyra dreamt of sound. She would hear it faintly, the low rumble of thunder, the crackle of fire, the echo of a name she could almost recall. When she awoke, the dreams left her trembling, desperate for something she could not define. A voice? A memory? Anything. Yet such things were forbidden. The sisterhood believed that attachment was the seed of corruption, that a silent sister's strength lay in her detachment from the psychic tide that polluted mankind. They were weapons forged from negation, instruments that could stand beside custodians without flinching at the Emperor's ineffable radiance. Her first trial came when she was 15 Terran years old. The Hall of Nulls, a vast chamber buried deep beneath the cloister, shielded by psychic dampeners and sanctified with wards etched in gold. There, she was stripped of all adornment and cast into a cell with another initiate, a girl whose eyes flickered with restrained panic. The abbess stood above them, hands clasped, expression unyielding. Two cannot share silence, she signed. Only one may remain. Lyra understood at once. The air between them became unbearable. Their overlapping null fields created a vacuum so profound it seemed to crush the life from the chamber itself. The candles died. The air grew heavy and hot. The other girl's breathing quickened, a soundless gasp. Lyra moved without conscious thought. The training had taken root deep within her muscles, deeper than morality. In a single motion she struck, driving her palm into the girl's throat, sending her sprawling. No sound escaped her lips, only the shudder of flesh against stone. When it was done, Lyra knelt beside her fallen sister, feeling nothing but the hollow ache in her chest. The abbess descended from her dais, silent as a shadow. She touched Lyra's brow and signed, "The void accepts you." Servitors dragged the body away without ceremony, no funeral, no mourning. Only the faint scent of incense to mask the iron tang of death. That night, Lyra did not sleep. She sat alone in the prayer alcove, staring at the unlit candles, feeling the emptiness that radiated from within her. For the first time, she wondered if this was holiness or damnation. From that day forward, Lyra carried the mark of ascension. Her scalp was shaven, her armor fitted, her flesh branded with the sigil of her order. She had become what the Imperium needed her to be, a living silence. When she walked through the cloister, others bowed their heads, not in reverence, but in relief that her gaze did not linger upon them. Yet the faint dream of sound persisted. It haunted her meditation, slipping through the cracks of discipline like water through stone. A whisper, soft and insistent. Remember. Years later, her order was summoned beyond the cloister. The summons came from the black ships, newly arrived from the Segmentum Solar, carrying psychers destined for judgment. The Sisters of Silence were to serve as escorts, ensuring the purity of transport and the containment of corruption. Lyra stood among them, armor gleaming dully in the torchlight, her expression unreadable. As the transport's ramp lowered, she smelled the tang of ozone, the scent of the warp's residue clinging to the condemned. One by one, the psychers were herded aboard, their eyes glazed with terror. Some murmured prayers, others screamed soundlessly, their voices swallowed by the sisters' collective null field. Lyra walked among them, her presence quelling their madness, her very being an anathema to the Imperium. She did not feel pity, she did not feel pride, only that familiar ache, the emptiness that made her both weapon and exile. As the black ship's engines roared to life, she turned her gaze toward Terra's horizon. The city sprawl stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of devotion and decay. Somewhere beyond those towers, the Emperor sat upon his golden throne, neither living nor dead, sustaining a galaxy that would tear itself apart without his will. Lyra tried to imagine his voice, what it might sound like if he spoke to her, if his light could pierce the silence that defined her. But she could not. The thought itself dissolved, leaving only stillness. When the ship ascended into the void, she felt it again, that phantom vibration beneath her ribs, like the memory of music. It passed as quickly as it came. Perhaps it was imagination, perhaps something else. Either way, she held on to it as one might hold on to the faintest flicker of warmth in an endless night. For the first time, Lyra wondered if silence could ever end. The black ship drifted through the void like a mausoleum adrift in eternity, its hull engraved with prayers that no one would ever hear. Inside, the air hummed with restrained terror. Hundreds of psychers were chained within containment cells, their minds flickering like dying embers. For them, each moment was a torment, each heartbeat a struggle against the pull of the warp that called to them in whispers only they could hear. But where Lyra walked, the whispers ceased. The corridors themselves seemed to recoil from her presence. The warp was mute in her shadow. The other sisters moved with her in perfect formation, silent as the space between stars. They wore masks of polished steel, their visors reflecting the faint lumen glow of the ship's interior. To see them was to behold a living absence, women whose faces were erased, whose voices had never existed. The psychers averted their gaze, trembling when one passed too near. Some tried to pray, but the words died on their tongues. Lyra felt the echoes of their despair, not as sound but as pressure, a faint tug at the edge of perception. She ignored it. Discipline was survival. Compassion was corrosion. During the voyage, she was assigned to oversee the containment deck. There, the cells pulsed with faint light as psychic restraints crackled and hissed. One among the captives drew her attention. A young man, pale and thin, eyes sunken but lucid. Unlike the others, he did not scream or thrash. He sat still, hands folded in prayer. When Lyra approached, his gaze lifted to meet hers. He smiled, faint and sorrowful. "I can't hear them anymore," he whispered, his voice trembling in the oppressive quiet. "It's peaceful." She said nothing. She couldn't. But something inside her shifted. A ripple of unease she could neither name nor banish. The man's eyes held no fear, only relief. He pressed a hand to the glass of his cell, his lips shaping words she could not bear to read. "Thank you." Lyra stepped back, her pulse quickening. The gesture had been human, gentle, undeserved. It was an intrusion into the perfect void she had built within herself. That night, as she knelt in meditation, she felt the echo of that word resounding through the hollowness of her being. Thank you. Gratitude for the absence she embodied. Reverence for a silence that destroyed. She began to see him in her thoughts, not as the psyker he was, but as a reflection of everything she could never be. He prayed to the Emperor for salvation. She served him by denying his voice. They were mirrors facing each other across an infinite gulf. And in that endless reflection, she began to wonder which of them was truly cursed. When the ship reached its destination, the atmosphere changed. Terra's beacon filled the void, the Astronomicon burning bright across the Imperium like the pulse of a god's dying heart. The psychers were prepared for offloading, processed through ritual inspection and branding. Those deemed too unstable were executed on the spot. The rest were marched in chains toward the Golden Throne. Lyra stood in the docking bay as the airlock hissed open, the glare of Terra's sun spilling in. The young psyker was among those selected for judgment. As he passed her, he met her gaze one last time. His lips formed silent words, a prayer perhaps, or farewell. Then the procession swallowed him, and he was gone. That night, Lyra dreamt again. She was standing in the cloister's prayer hall, but the candles were lit, and the air was filled with sound, soft, resonant, like a hymn carried on the wind. She turned, and there he was, the psyker, his eyes bright with impossible light. "Do you hear it now?" he asked. She tried to answer, but her voice would not come. Instead, the hymn grew louder until it was unbearable, until it filled her skull with pain. And then, with a suddenness that stole her breath, the light vanished, and all was silence once more. She woke in her cell, trembling, her breath shallow. For the first time, the silence felt wrong, not sacred, but suffocating. It pressed in on her from every side, a weight too heavy to bear. She looked at her reflection in the polished wall, saw the faint scar at her temple, the brand upon her arm, the eyes that no longer belonged to anyone. In that moment, she understood what the abbess had meant when she said the void accepts. Acceptance was not mercy. It was obliteration. The following morning, she was summoned to the sanctum. The abbess awaited her, robed in black, her face hidden behind a golden mask. Around them, the other sisters stood in formation, motionless as statues. The abbess's hands moved slowly in the ritual language. You have seen the warp and not fallen. You have carried silence and not broken. The Emperor's will is proven through you. A custodian guard entered, his armor gleaming like sunlight on molten metal. His presence filled the chamber with authority beyond comprehension. Even the abbess inclined her head. His voice, deep and resonant, broke the air for the first time in months. You are called to service beyond this cloister. The Golden Throne requires your order. You will be his hound in the void. The words struck Lyra like a blade. Service beyond, the battlefield, the witch hunts. the endless crusades waged in the Emperor's name. She bowed her head, the gesture automatic, her hands forming the sign of assent. But inside, something stirred. A memory, a defiance, a question without sound. Was this holiness or penance? As the custodian turned and the sisters followed him in solemn procession, Lyra lingered for a heartbeat longer. The chamber was utterly still. She placed her hand against the cold marble floor, feeling the vibration of the distant machinery that sustained the throne above. Somewhere, the Emperor endured, unmoving, unhearing, the anchor of mankind's fragile faith. She wondered, for the first time, if he dreamed. The thought was a heresy, but it stayed with her, burning like a hidden ember beneath her silence. And when she rose to follow the others into the lightless corridors of duty, she carried it with her, a question the void could never answer. That was how the Emperor's hound was born, not in glory, not in devotion, but in doubt. And the silence that followed her was absolute. If the echoes of that silence have already taken hold of you, if you feel that unease in the back of your mind, as though something unseen listens from the void, stay with me. Like the whisper of static across a broken Vox channel, there are stories here that few dare to hear aloud. Lend this silence your attention. Share it so it might reach one more soul before it's swallowed by the warp. And subscribe so that when the next truth emerges from the ashes, you'll be there to witness it. The world of training they brought her to was not Terra, though it bore the Emperor's mark in every shattered stone. Its name was Ophelion 9, a place forgotten by all but those who entered it and never left. It was a dead moon, orbiting a gas giant whose storms cast eternal lightning across the void. From orbit, it gleamed like an eye that refused to close. To Lyra Vane, it was a fitting cradle for silence. The black ship descended through atmosphere thick with ash, its hull screaming against the friction of descent. When the ramp lowered, a gale swept through, stinging her eyes with dust. The landscape stretched endless. Gray rock, black towers, and citadels half buried in centuries of devotion and decay. They said the Order of the Veiled Blade had trained there since the Age of Apostasy. The air still carried the scent of burnt incense and ozone, remnants of rituals older than memory. The sisters called the place the Sanctum of the Unheard. No voices had been raised there in millennia, no laughter, no song, no prayer aloud. It was a world where words were treason, where silence was the holiest of sacraments. Lyra stepped onto its surface and felt the vibration beneath her boots. The pulse of an ancient machine network deep below, still alive, still serving the Emperor's will long after its builders had turned to dust. The abbess who oversaw Ophelion 9 was called Seraphine Vorn. She was tall, her presence commanding, her eyes like cold stars. Her gestures carried the weight of absolute authority. When she welcomed Lyra, it was not with warmth, but with purpose. "You are the void made flesh," her hands declared. "Here you will learn to wield that void until even faith itself trembles before you." Training began at dawn and ended only when exhaustion became transcendence. The sisters learned to fight without voice, to kill without passion. Their weapons were extensions of their will, blades blessed in silence, bolters marked with the sigil of negation. Lyra's first lessons were not of combat, but of endurance. They placed her in meditation cells where psychic interference machines howled like wounded beasts, flooding the mind with illusions of the warp. For days, she would sit unmoving, her null field consuming the corruption around her until the air grew still and the machines fell silent. The tutors measured success not by strength, but by stillness. Lyra adapted quickly, her body hardened by years of deprivation, but her mind remained restless, The dreams that haunted her aboard the black ship had not faded, they had deepened. Sometimes, when she meditated, she saw flashes. A voice that wasn't a voice, light through fractured glass, the memory of a prayer half forgotten. It always ended the same way, the feeling of someone calling her name in a place where no sound existed. When she opened her eyes, there was only stone and shadow. Her instructors warned against such thoughts. The void is absolute. Seraphine signed during a night ritual, her hands moving with the precision of a liturgy. To imagine something beyond it is to invite weakness. Lyra accepted the rebuke, bowing low, but her heart rebelled in ways she could not confess. She had seen what weakness looked like, the hollow-eyed psychers collapsing under her gaze, the man who had thanked her for his silence. If that was weakness, she thought, then perhaps weakness was the last proof of humanity. Weeks became seasons. The sisters drilled in formation across the black plains beneath Ophelian storms. The lightning flashed without thunder, illuminating ranks of armored figures moving as one organism. They practiced silent coordination, reading intent through the tilt of a head, the shift of a blade, the faint ripple of a breath. The air was filled with motion but devoid of sound, and in that wordless rhythm lay beauty, an artistry of annihilation. Lyra found herself moving through the routines with mechanical perfection, each gesture a prayer of negation, and yet beneath it a flicker of dissonance remained. Her closest companion, if such a word could exist among the sisterhood, was a warrior named Iliane Drust. She was older, scarred across one cheek, her gaze sharp as the edges of her sword. They rarely exchanged gestures beyond duty, but in the long hours of watch when lightning lit the barracks, Iliane would sometimes trace symbols upon the floor, not formal script, but fragments of personal memory, a name, a place, a thought too human to speak. Lyra never answered, yet she watched those movements with quiet fascination. It was rebellion, but a quiet one, a defiance written in air. During one such vigil, Iliane caught her gaze and smiled faintly, a rare, almost forbidden expression. Her fingers shaped a single word, remember. Then she turned away. The next day, Iliane was gone. No explanation, no ceremony, only an empty cot and a folded shroud. When Lyra inquired through gesture, Seraphine replied without hesitation. She heard the warp whisper. Her silence failed. Lyra nodded as duty demanded. But that night, when she closed her eyes, she saw Iliane standing beneath the storm, her face calm, her mouth open as if speaking a word no one would ever hear. The lightning flared, and Lyra woke to find herself trembling. The next phase of training began soon after. The sisters were summoned into the catacombs of Stillwater, a vast subterranean complex carved by servitors in ages past. There, they were stripped of armor and weaponry, left with only the robes of penitence. The tunnels twisted endlessly, filled with darkness that pressed against the skin like breath. Somewhere deep within, the instructors released captured psychers, failed subjects from the black ships, minds shattered by warp exposure. The sisters were ordered to hunt them, to test the limits of their null fields against the horrors of the Imperium. Lyra descended alone. The darkness was complete. Her footsteps were the only sound, faint, but even that seemed sacrilegious. As she advanced, she felt the warp before she saw it, a sickly heat, a vibration in her skull like static before a storm. The psyker emerged from the gloom, a woman once human, her body twisted by uncontrolled mutation, her eyes glowing with unnatural light. The creature shrieked, and the air trembled with psychic force. But Lyra felt nothing. Her presence devoured the sound, consumed the energy, reduced the warp-born fury to a whisper and then to nothing. She moved forward, blade raised. The psyker faltered, collapsing beneath the crushing weight of nullification. Lyra hesitated for a heartbeat, saw, for an instant, the pleading expression that lingered on the creature's distorted face, and then struck. The blade pierced through, clean and silent. When she emerged from the catacombs, bloodless but shaken, Seraphine awaited her. "You hesitated," the abbess signed. Lyra lowered her gaze. She was suffering. "Mercy is the warp's language," Seraphine answered. "We do not speak it. The words, though silent, cut deeper than any blade." Lyra bowed, accepting punishment. But inside, she knew the truth. Something within her still clung to that forbidden voice, that phantom echo from her dreams. And as the storms raged above Ophelian 9, Lyra began to wonder if silence, perfect and holy, could also be a form of death. The punishments on Ophelian 9 were not cruel for cruelty's sake. They were crafted with the precision of a sermon. When Seraphine decreed that Lyra's hesitation had earned penance, the order was carried out without ceremony. She was bound by oath to the pillars of stillness, a ring of obsidian monoliths standing in the open under the cold lightning storms. The sisters called it the Vigil of the Unheard. Those who faltered were sent there to remember that the Emperor demanded perfection even in silence. Lyra was made to stand motionless for 3 days. She was not permitted shelter, not even the bare mercy of shade. The storm winds scoured her flesh raw, and the cold bit deep until even pain became distant. Around her, the desert stretched featureless and empty, broken only by the flicker of electric light on metal. It was there, in that endless solitude, that she first began to feel the edge of something different, not the presence of sound, but of awareness. A rhythm beneath the static, the sensation of being watched by something vast and unseen. At first, she dismissed it as exhaustion. Hallucinations were not uncommon during the vigil. The void played tricks on the mind, offering whispers of false revelation to those desperate enough to listen. But as the hours turned into days, the feeling grew stronger. In the corners of her vision, she thought she saw faint figures moving across the horizon. Silhouettes of other sisters long dead, or perhaps reflections of herself in the storm's flash. One lifted a hand as if in greeting, though the gesture was impossible. There were no spirits in the void, only echoes. Yet she felt the movement resonate deep within her, as if the silence itself were answering. When the vigil ended, she was released without acknowledgement. The sisters did not praise endurance, they merely recorded survival. Lyra's armor was returned to her, newly inscribed with a faint glyph, the mark of correction, a reminder carved into the ceramite of her pauldron. She was permitted to rejoin training as if nothing had occurred. But something within her had changed. Her movements were still perfect, her gaze steady, her silence absolute. And yet there lingered a question, a tremor beneath the stillness. That tremor grew during the next phase of her training. The sisters were ordered to engage in simulation combat against the Custodian Guard, the Emperor's own golden sentinels. It was not an equal contest. It was never meant to be. The custodians towered over them, their movements both graceful and inevitable, as if they fought not with effort, but with destiny itself. Yet the sisters did not retreat. Their null fields rendered psychic enhancement useless, forcing even those golden warriors to rely on skill and instinct alone. Lyra's squad faced their custodian in the central arena, a chamber lit by shafts of cold light filtering through armored glass. When the signal came, they moved as one, a ripple of motion in perfect coordination. Bolter fire echoed, blades flashed, and for a heartbeat, Lyra's world was pure rhythm. She darted beneath a sweeping halberd, the air humming with displaced force, and struck, her blade glancing harmlessly off Oromite, but enough to draw the custodian's focus. That was her role. Distraction, misdirection, the flicker of silence before the killing strike. But the custodian's counter was too fast. His halberd spun, and Lyra barely raised her arm in time to block. The impact sent her sprawling, armor denting, breath stolen. She rolled to her knees, sword poised, when the custodian halted mid-motion. His visor tilted, and for a moment, impossible and real, he regarded her not as a target, but as a person. "You carry his silence well," he said, his voice a deep resonance that filled the chamber. The words pierced her like a blade. No one had spoken to her in years. Even through the modulator of his helm, his tone held something almost human. Respect, perhaps, or pity. Before she could react, he turned and strode away, his crimson cape sweeping behind him. Lyra stood alone in the echoing chamber, trembling, though she did not understand why. His words repeated in her mind like a forbidden hymn. "You carry his silence well." It was meant as commendation, but she felt it as accusation. That night, in the dormitory beneath the training halls, she could not sleep. The storm outside raged without sound, flashes of light cutting across the ceiling. She lay on her cot, watching the shadows move, feeling the pulse of her heartbeat against the stillness. Each beat sounded like a drum in her skull, each breath a trespass. She wanted to still them, to disappear completely, to become what the order demanded, silence incarnate. But another part of her resisted, small and defiant, the part that still dreamed of sound. In the following months, she mastered every weapon placed in her hands. Bolters, execution blades, flame tongues, shock pikes, each became an extension of her will. Her null field grew stronger, sharper. Psychers could not bear her presence even for a second without bleeding from the eyes. The instructors watched her progress with silent approval, marking her as a candidate for the Emperor's active legions. The name whispered through the cloister, Excrucia Detachment, the elite, the executioners who walked beside the custodian guard and purged the Imperium's most dangerous heresies. Lyra accepted the assignment without hesitation. Service was purpose. Purpose was salvation. And yet, as she prepared to depart Ophelian 9, she found herself standing once more upon the observation deck overlooking the storm. The lightning flared across the endless horizon, painting the ruins in brief, brilliant light. She thought of Iliane, of the psyker who had thanked her, of the custodian's voice still echoing in memory. All of them had spoken in defiance of the silence. All of them were gone. She raised her hand, tracing a symbol in the air, not the formal script of the sisterhood, but the same forbidden word Iliane had once written upon the floor. Remember, the storm swallowed it whole, erasing every trace. When Lyra turned away, she was ready. The shuttle that bore her from Ophelian 9 rose through the clouds like a blade cutting through eternity. Below, the world receded into shadow, its towers and sanctuaries dissolving beneath the tempest. Ahead lay Terra's light, and beyond that, the endless darkness of the galaxy, a theater of war that would know her silence soon enough. And as the stars opened before her, Lyra realized that what she had mistaken for discipline was not mastery over silence, but surrender to it. She had been taught to kill her voice, her doubt, her compassion, but not her memory. That, even silence could not devour. In the reflection of her visor, the lightning still burned. The journey from Ophelian 9 to Terra was not long by the standards of the Imperium, but time aboard the void ship stretched unnaturally, distorted by the warp and the weight of purpose. The Sisters of Silence traveled in darkness, their chambers unlit save for the faint blue glow of lumen strips running along the walls. Lyra sat among them, motionless in prayer, though no words left her lips. Their devotion was measured not in sound, but in the stillness between breaths. Each sister carried herself with the gravity of inevitability. They had been sculpted into instruments of the Emperor's will, stripped of every layer of identity until only purpose remained. Yet, within that unity, there was something terrible. A collective emptiness so complete it seemed to absorb the light itself. Lyra could feel it pressing against her skin, the combined null fields resonating in cold harmony. The warp was far away here, denied and banished by their very presence. And yet, in that hollow peace, her dreams grew more vivid than ever. She saw flashes, not of the cloisters or the training grounds, but of the black ship, the psyker who had thanked her, the shimmer of his eyes as they dimmed. Sometimes she dreamt of Iliane, standing among the lightning towers, her hand raised in the sign of remembrance. Sometimes she heard the custodian's voice, low and steady. "You carry his silence well." But more often now she saw something else, a vast figure seated upon a throne of gold, shrouded in light so fierce it seared her mind's eye. Around him swirled a galaxy of souls, billions of them, crying out in worship and agony, and at the heart of that radiance, a single whisper echoed through the void. It was not the Emperor's voice, it could not be, and yet it spoke her name. When she awoke from such dreams, she could not breathe. The silence pressed down on her chest like a physical weight, as though the air itself sought to erase her. She told no one. The sisterhood did not dream, they purged dreams as weakness. Still, Lyra began to feel that something was changing inside her. Not corruption, but awareness. The silence she had carried all her life no longer felt absolute. Beneath it pulsed the faint rhythm of something alive, as though the void itself had a heartbeat. When the ship docked at Terra's orbiting station, the sisters disembarked in solemn formation. Custodian escorts awaited them, gleaming in auramite and crimson. They led the detachment through the docking spires and down into the heart of the Imperial Palace, where light filtered through cathedrals of metal and stone. The air smelled of incense and ozone, of burning faith and machine oil. Lyra had seen the palace once before, but now it felt different, not holy but hollow. Every corridor echoed with the memory of footsteps and prayers long faded. The statues of saints and warriors loomed above, their eyes blind, their hands forever raised in supplication to a god who no longer answered. At the heart of the complex stood the Hall of Judgment, where the Excrucia detachment assembled before the golden banner of the Imperium. Seraphine Vorn herself was there to deliver them into service. Her gestures were precise, her movements like scripture. "You are the silence that guards the light," she signed. "You are the weapon that asks no mercy. Where others see miracles, you will see necessity. Where others hear faith, you will hear nothing. That is your gift." The custodian assigned to their detachment stepped forward, the same warrior who had once spoken to Lyra during training. His armor gleamed with sanctified oil, his helm tucked beneath one arm. Without the mask, his face was ageless, carved from discipline. "I am Valen Kor," he said simply. "You will answer to me when words are required, but know this: silence is often clearer than command." The sisters inclined their heads in unison. Lyra did not trust herself to meet his gaze. His voice carried memory, and memory was dangerous. Their first mission came swiftly. A transmission from the Segmentum Obscurus, a distress signal from a fortress world where psychic anomalies had erupted after the sudden death of an astropathic choir. The custodians were to secure the relic vaults, while the sisters purged the taint that lingered in the wake of psychic collapse. It was a small operation by imperial measure, one of countless unrecorded battles fought in the shadows of the Imperium's vast machinery. Yet for Lyra, it would be the beginning of understanding what the sisterhood truly was. Not guardians, not saints, but erasers of meaning itself. The void ship that bore them to the fortress was silent, save for the hum of engines. Valen spoke rarely, and when he did, it was brief and without ceremony. The sisters prayed through gesture, each movement sharp as a blade. Lyra joined them, but her focus drifted to the stars beyond the viewport, countless points of light burning in a sea of endless black. Somewhere among them, she thought, someone was speaking a prayer that would never reach its god. When they arrived, the fortress was already dead. Its towers had crumbled inward, its gates half-fused by plasma fire. The air was thick with ash, the ground scorched with sigils of psychic backlash. As Lyra stepped through the ruin, her null field absorbed the residual warp energy, and for the first time she understood why the sisterhood was both feared and needed. The silence she brought was not absence, it was cleansing. The world seemed to breathe easier in her presence, the madness dissipating like smoke. But the deeper they went, the more wrong the silence felt. It was not the natural stillness of the sisterhood, but something else. A void born of annihilation. Valen halted the squad near the central spire, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Be wary," he said softly. "This place is too quiet, even for death." They found the choir chamber soon after. It was a cathedral of ruin. Its roof collapsed, the remains of the astropaths still seated in a perfect circle. Their bodies were blackened husks, mouths open in silent screams. The air shimmered faintly with residual energy. Lyra stepped closer, her breath shallow. As her null field expanded, the shimmer vanished, but in that instant she heard something. Not with her ears, but with her soul. A whisper, faint as dust on glass, "Help us." She froze. The other sisters moved past her, oblivious. The custodian gave no sign of hearing. The whisper came again, softer now, fading with every heartbeat. It was impossible. She was null. No psychic could touch her, no voice could cross the void she carried. And yet, the words lingered, echoing within her skull. "Help us." Lyra turned away, forcing her breathing steady. The silence pressed close, smothering the thought. Perhaps it was only memory, she told herself. A remnant of the warp collapsing under her field. But deep down, she knew better. Something in that chamber had reached across the gulf. Something had spoken through the silence. And as they left the ruin behind, bound for the void once more, Lyra carried the whisper with her. It pulsed faintly beneath her armor like a heartbeat that was not her own. The first true war Lyra ever fought was not against the living. It was against what remained after faith died. The fortress world of Nastrond burned beneath the light of its own heresy, the sky fractured by warp storms, the oceans boiled into clouds of blood-red vapor. When the Excrucia detachment landed, the planet was already half swallowed by the Imperium, its vox traffic reduced to static wails. The custodian guard moved with divine precision through the inferno, gold armor gleaming even beneath the ash, their halberds cutting through both flesh and corruption. The sisters followed in their wake, not as warriors of glory, but as shadows that consumed the echoes of the warp. Lyra stepped from the gunship into air that screamed. The ground pulsed faintly underfoot, alive with psychic residue. The world itself had been infected. Voices clawed at the edges of perception, the whispers of souls unmoored, crying out for mercy, for release. Her null field devoured them one by one, leaving only the heavy stillness of her presence. Around her, mortal soldiers of the Astra Militarum watched with awe and dread. They called the custodians angels, but they called the sisters something else entirely. Witches of silence, the daughters without souls. Their orders were simple: locate the source of the anomaly and purge it, no matter what form it took. The custodians would defend the structure's perimeter. The sisters would descend into its heart. The structure was a cathedral once, devoted to the Emperor's light. Now it was a monument of decay, its walls pulsing with veins of psychic ichor, its stained glass alive with distorted motion. As Lyra entered, her breath misted before her face, though the air was hot. Her armor's joints hissed softly as she moved, blade drawn, bolter ready. The silence around her was complete. Not merely the absence of sound, but the active devouring of it. Even the creak of her boots seemed to vanish before it reached her ears. They advanced in formation, 6 sisters moving as one. Their visors reflected the faint glow of corrupted relics strewn across the nave. At the far end of the hall stood an altar twisted into an obscene parody of the imperial Aquila. Beneath it lay a man, or what had once been one. His flesh shimmered with warp light, his limbs stretched impossibly thin. He turned as they approached, his mouth moving in prayer, though no sound escaped. Then the world screamed. The psychic eruption hit like fire and frost combined, an invisible blast that would have annihilated any mortal. But the sisters' null fields converged, absorbing it, smothering it until the warp itself recoiled. Lyra moved without hesitation, sprinting forward through the storm, her blade rising and falling in perfect, soundless arcs. The creature convulsed, light bleeding from its eyes, and as she struck the final blow, the cathedral's stained glass shattered inward, shards glittering like falling stars. When it was over, there was no sound at all, no screams, no crack of weapons, only the hiss of cooling air. The warp anomaly collapsed in on itself, leaving behind only ash. Lyra stood among the ruins, her breathing steady, her pulse calm. It was victory, but it felt like erasure. Valen Kor entered soon after, his armor streaked with blood and ash. He regarded her in silence for a long moment before speaking. "Efficient," he said, voice low and deliberate. "The Emperor's will is served." Lyra inclined her head. She wanted to believe that was true, that every corpse they left behind was a piece of order restored to the galaxy. Yet, as she looked upon the altar, blackened and broken, she could not shake the feeling that something vital had been extinguished. The silence she carried was a balm, yes, but it was also a blade that cut too deeply. That night, they camped in the ruins of the city. The sky above flickered with auroras of warp light, slowly fading into normality. The soldiers celebrated their salvation in hushed tones, as though fearing to offend the sisters' presence. Lyra sat apart from them, her armor laid beside her, the cold air biting at her bare skin. She traced her gloved fingers over the scratches in her blade, feeling each mark like a confession. Every strike she had delivered was perfect, too perfect. Perfection left no space for meaning. Valen approached her as the night deepened. He did not speak at first, only stood beside her, gazing toward the dying auroras. His presence radiated stillness, not like hers but of a different kind. Where her silence devoured, his commanded. Finally, he said, "You do not rest." She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "I do not need to," she signed, hands moving with ritual precision. He nodded. "Perhaps not, but even weapons must be maintained. The Emperor demands endurance, not decay." Lyra hesitated, then raised her hands again. "You think me decaying?" "No." He looked at her fully now, his eyes reflecting the pale glow of the stars. "I think you are listening for something you should not hear." Her fingers froze mid-motion. "What do you mean?" Valen's gaze drifted back to the horizon. "There is a kind of silence that speaks louder than sound. You have carried it since Ophelion. Do not mistake its whisper for the Emperor's voice." Before she could respond, he turned and left, his armor glinting briefly before vanishing into the dark. Lyra remained where she was, the cold air moving softly around her. His words echoed within her like a warning, or perhaps a truth she had already known. The silence did whisper, and deep within it she could feel something watching her, waiting. When dawn came, Nastrond was declared sanctified. The warp storms receded, the air cleared, and the banners of the Imperium were raised once more. Yet the victory brought no peace. Lyra stood aboard the departing ship, gazing down at the cleansed world, and thought of all that had been erased in the name of purity. Whole lives, whole voices, consumed by the same void she served. It should have filled her with pride. Instead, it filled her with a sorrow so deep it felt almost holy. She looked toward the stars and wondered if the Emperor's silence was not just command, but reflection. The crusade that followed devoured decades, though for Lyra it passed like a dream without dawn or dusk. The Excrucia detachment was called to worlds whose names blurred together in a haze of smoke and blood. Some had fallen to witchcraft, others to heresy, others still to the slow rot of despair that festered in the Imperium's forgotten edges. Wherever the Emperor's light had dimmed, the sisters came to restore it, not with mercy, but with annihilation. Each campaign was the same symphony of silence and death. The custodians moved like golden retribution, their halberds cutting arcs of sunfire through the night. The sisters followed as the echo of that light, the shadow that swallowed all resistance, the null tide that erased the warp's corruption. To the psychers they faced, they were oblivion given form. To the common soldier, they were nightmares in human shape. Lyra felt neither pride nor fear, only a purpose. Each step forward, each kill delivered, reaffirmed the doctrine that had forged her, to serve by erasing. But in the quiet after battle, her thoughts began to betray her. When the war chants faded and the ashes cooled, she would sometimes wander among the ruins, through burned chapels where saints' faces had melted into molten glass, through manufactura where servitors still twitched in the absence of command. There, amid the carcasses of devotion, she began to notice things the others did not. The faint outline of prayers carved into walls before they were scorched away. The small altars left behind by soldiers who knew they would die. The echo of voices that once believed salvation would come. It was not pity she felt, nor even rebellion. It was recognition. These people had worshipped the Emperor as she did, unseen, unanswered, desperate to serve something that could not speak back. But where they sought comfort, she brought silence. She was the proof that he listened only by negation. On the 10th world they purged, something changed. It was a place called Volmirath, an oceanic moon where an entire sect of sanctioned psychers had gone mad simultaneously. Reports spoke of mass visions, of lights that wept from the sky, of choirs singing without mouths. When the sisters arrived, the seas themselves were glowing, faintly, alive with warp bloom. The custodians ordered immediate containment. The sisters descended into the flooded temples where the madness had begun. The halls were filled with statues of the Emperor carved from coral, their faces eroded into vague masks of sorrow. The water reached Lyra's knees, rippling with faint psychic luminescence. She moved carefully, her null field consuming the light as she passed. The closer she came to the temple's core, the more the glow dimmed, until only darkness remained. At the heart of the chamber, a single figure knelt before the altar. He was old, robed in the remnants of an astropath's garb, his blind sockets turned upward as though still beholding some distant star. Around him floated fragments of broken relics, rosaries, data slates, bones, orbiting slowly in defiance of gravity. His lips moved constantly, murmuring words that could not exist in the material world. Lyra approached, blade drawn. The water stilled around her as her presence smothered the warp's breath. The astropath's head tilted, and for an instant she thought he smiled. "You bring his silence," he said, his voice echoing, not through air but directly into her mind. "I have waited for it." Lyra froze. That voice was impossible. No psychic could touch her. No thought could cross the barrier of her null field. Yet his words vibrated within her skull like the low tolling of a cathedral bell. "You hear me," the old man whispered. "Even through the void, you hear. That is why you were made." She lunged forward, the blade cleaving the air, but the strike met only mist. The astropath dissolved into light, his form scattering like dust upon the water. For a heartbeat, the chamber shone with brilliance, and then darkness fell, absolute and complete. The other sisters arrived moments later, weapons raised. They found only Lyra, standing motionless before the altar, her blade dripping black water. When they questioned her in gesture, she replied simply, "Target neutralized." They accepted it without doubt. The Emperor's will was done. The custodian sealed the temple with fire and decree, and the oceans boiled anew. But Lyra knew what she had seen, or what had seen her. That whisper had pierced the silence. It had spoken to her in the place where no voice should exist, and it had called her maid. After Volmirath, the dreams returned with a violence she could no longer ignore. She saw the Emperor not as light, but as shadow, vast, unmoving, surrounded by the flicker of a million souls. His eyes were open but empty, reflecting nothing but the void. She heard the same voice from the temple, echoing through endless halls of gold and bone. "You are my silence. You are my wound upon the world." When she woke, her heart was racing. Around her, the sisters prayed as they always did, serene and expressionless. None of them stirred, none reacted. If they dreamed, they did not remember. Lyra wondered if their silence was truly chosen, or imposed. In the following months, her detachment fought on a dozen worlds. Each victory deepened her unease. She began to feel the silence not as devotion, but as hunger, a force that devoured all it touched, growing stronger with every life extinguished. Her null field expanded further than it should have, bending air, snuffing out flame. Once, a custodian passed too, near and staggered, his balance faltering. He stared at her with something like alarm before regaining composure. That night, Valen confronted her. "You are changing," he said quietly, his face half hidden beneath his hood. "Your silence grows too deep. Even the custodes feel it now." Lyra raised her hands. "I am faithful." He shook his head. "Faith and power are not the same. The Emperor's light is balance, his silence restraint. What you carry is neither." Her gestures faltered. "Then what am I?" For the first time, Valen did not answer. He looked at her for a long moment, the weight of millennia in his gaze, then turned away. When he left, Lyra stood alone in the dark, her breath misting in the cold air of the ship. Around her, the sisters slept in perfect stillness, their minds empty, their souls quiet. She envied them and pitied them and feared them all at once. Because now, when she closed her eyes, the silence no longer comforted her. It listened back. There came a campaign without name, one that would never find its way into any imperial record, fought in the forgotten fringes of the segmentum tempestus. There, The veil between real space and the warp was thin as breath, and entire fleets vanished without echo. The Excrucia detachment was dispatched in secrecy, bearing the Emperor's word as judgment. Their task, to locate a lost black ship that had gone silent during its passage to Terra. The Penance of Virtue, it had been called. A vessel vast enough to carry a city within its hull, laden with psychers destined for the Golden Throne's tithe. Its disappearance was an omen too dire to ignore. Some said it had been claimed by demons. Others whispered it had become a shrine of madness adrift among the stars. The truth, Lyra would discover, was something else entirely. When their strike cruiser emerged from the warp, they found the Penance waiting, or rather, what remained of it. The ship drifted in dead orbit around a nameless world, its hull scarred with deep fractures that pulsed faintly with inner light. Vox channels failed. Auspex readings flickered with impossible signatures. Even the custodians stood still before the site, their golden armor reflecting the ghostly radiance of the derelict. They boarded at the 13th hour of watch, descending into corridors lit only by the occasional spark of dying systems. The air was stale, thick with the metallic scent of decay. Broken relics floated through the zero-gravity halls, rosaries, fragments of data slates, shards of armor. Every sound seemed to fade before reaching the ear. Lyra could feel the silence pressing in like the closing of a tomb. The further they advanced, the worse it became. Psyker containment cells stood open, their restraints torn apart not by brute strength but by something far more deliberate. The walls were marked with sigils that burned faintly even as her null field consumed them. In one corridor, they found the crew, hundreds of bodies suspended in midair, their faces turned upward, mouths open in identical expressions of awe. No blood, no wounds, only emptiness behind their eyes. Valen led from the front, his halberd ready. "Whatever did this," he murmured, "it did not come from the warp, it came from within." The sisters spread out, their fields overlapping until even the faint flicker of psychic residue vanished. Yet still, Lyra felt it, the pulse she had carried since Vol Mirath, that impossible echo beneath the silence. It guided her steps as though drawing her toward something, some center of gravity within the void. They reached the ship's chapel at last. Its doors were sealed from within, layered with wax seals bearing the sigil of the Inquisition. Valen's gauntlet closed around the latch, tearing it free with a screech of metal. The chamber beyond glowed with faint amber light. Candles floated in midair, unmelted, their flames burning motionless. At the center of the chapel, upon the altar, sat a throne of twisted steel and bone, and upon that throne, a figure, unmoving, clad in the tatters of a sister's armor. Lyra stepped forward, each motion deliberate. Her visor caught the reflection of the figure's face, or what was left of it. The features were familiar. The hollow eyes, the scar across the temple, the faint tattoo of the veiled blade's sigil. It was Iliane Drust, the same woman who had once smiled at her beneath the lightning of Ophelion 9. Her body was mummified, preserved by the ship's failing systems, her hands folded in her lap as though in prayer. Around her, the air shimmered faintly with energy that Lyra could feel but not identify. Not warp, not matter, something in between. Valen approached cautiously. "A relic?" he asked, "or a warning?" Lyra could not answer. Her breath had frozen in her chest. The pulse within her had become deafening now, thrumming through every nerve. She felt drawn to the throne, as if some invisible thread connected her to it. When she reached out a hand, her gauntlet brushed the air before Iliane's face, and the candles guttered. A voice filled the chamber, soft and familiar. "Remember." The sound did not come from her vox, It came from within. Valen shouted her name, but she could not hear him. The world fell away, replaced by light that was not light, a radiance that consumed thought and sight alike. She saw Ophelia Nye burning, the training grounds dissolving into nothing. She saw the Emperor's palace, its spires cracking like glass beneath the weight of time. And beyond it all, she saw him, the Emperor upon his golden throne, vast and still. His eyes were open, and in them was silence infinite. Then, beneath that silence, a whisper. "You are my echo, the void through which I endure." Lyra gasped, falling to her knees. The vision shattered. The chapel was dark again. Volan stood before her, weapon raised, eyes wide behind his helm. "What happened?" he demanded. She tried to speak, to explain, but no sound came. Her voice, the one she had never used, was gone, consumed utterly. Behind her, the throne was empty. Ilyane's body had crumbled into dust. Only her armor remained, gleaming faintly with golden residue. Volan stared at the remnants, his expression unreadable. "We burned the ship," he said finally. "No record, no relic. The Emperor's hounds leave no trail of madness behind." The detachment withdrew. The penance of virtue was consumed by fire, its ashes scattered across the void. But as the flames rose, Lyra felt no relief. Within her, the silence no longer felt like armor, it felt like inheritance. Something had passed from Ilyan into her, a memory, a message, a contagion of knowing. In the days that followed, she did not sleep. When she closed her eyes, she heard it again. "You are my echo." And for the first time, she realized what that meant. The Emperor's silence was not simply absence, it was reflection. The endless return of everything humanity feared to understand. The Sisters of Silence did not merely serve him. They were what remained of him, fragments of the divine void, walking, breathing, erasing. When she next saw Valen, he avoided her gaze. "The custodians report anomalies in your readings," he said. "Your field expands beyond measure. The palace will call you back soon for study." Lyra nodded, expression calm. Inside, she felt the hum of that impossible heartbeat. It pulsed with every breath, every movement, every moment of stillness. She no longer feared it. The Emperor's hounds hunted witches and heretics. But she had seen what lay beyond that duty, the truth buried beneath prayer and silence. They were not his weapons, they were his confession. And in that realization, the silence finally spoke. Terra was not as she remembered it. When Lyra returned, summoned by decree of the palace, the world seemed older, heavier beneath its own sanctity. The skies were dim, the towers wept rust, and the endless processions of pilgrims shuffled through the ash like shadows wearing human skin. She watched from the viewport as the shuttle descended, the continent-spanning sprawl of the Imperial Palace rising beneath her like the skeleton of a dying god. The light that poured from its towers was not golden now, but pale, feverish. Even faith had a half-life. The Sisters of the Veiled Blade awaited her in the sanctum of the unheard. None met her eyes. Their gestures were precise, formal, distant. They treated her not as one of their own, but as something fragile or dangerous. She had felt it too. Her null field no longer obeyed boundaries. Servitors short-circuited as she passed. Vox units died mid-prayer. The air itself seemed thinner in her presence, as if reluctant to vibrate. Abbess Seraphine Vorn greeted her in the Chamber of Petitions. Time had not softened the woman. Her face was a lattice of fine scars, her gaze sharp enough to cut. Yet, when she beheld Lyra, a flicker of unease passed across her expression before she masked it. "You were summoned to account for the anomaly," Seraphine signed, her hands deliberate. "Explain." Lyra bowed low, armor whispering against stone. I obeyed my orders. I did not summon what followed. And yet something followed you, the abbess replied. We feel it even here. The silence clings to you like oil. It is not the Emperor's design. Lyra hesitated. Words, even silent ones, felt inadequate. How could she explain that the silence no longer felt external, that it pulsed beneath her ribs like a living thing, that she sometimes felt it watching through her own eyes? Instead, she signed simply, I will submit to testing. Seraphine regarded her for a long time. Then she nodded. You will be brought before the Ordo Custodes. They will decide whether your silence is service or corruption. The word struck her like a blade. Corruption, the one accusation no sister could ever escape alive. To be impure was to be unmade, reduced to ash in the very halls she had once served. Yet Lyra felt no fear, only inevitability. Whatever she had become, it had already surpassed judgment. The custodians came for her at dusk. 2 of them, their golden armor reflecting the dying light through the sanctum's high windows. They spoke little as they escorted her through corridors deep beneath the palace, places few mortals ever walked. The air grew colder with every step. The sound of the world above faded until only the pulse of ancient machinery remained. At last, they reached the chamber of the throne's veins, a labyrinth of conduits that carried the Emperor's sustaining energies across Terra's crust. Here, even the custodians moved with reverence. The light was dim, filtered through kilometers of sanctified crystal. Valen, Kor, awaited them. He stood without helmet, his face drawn but resolute. When his eyes met hers, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or regret. The High Custodian requested your presence, he said quietly. He wishes to see what remains of you. His tone carried no malice, only weariness. Lyra nodded and followed. They entered a hall vast enough to dwarf Titans. Pillars of gold and marble rose into shadows so high they seemed to touch eternity. At the center stood a dais surrounded by relic machines, their runes pulsing with faint light. Valen gestured for her to stand upon it. The machinery hummed to life, tendrils of energy sweeping over her armor, scanning, measuring. For long minutes, nothing happened. Then, one by one, the lumen flares died. The readings collapsed into void. The attending custodian turned to Valen. She consumes the signal, he said. No reflection, no return. It's as if she doesn't exist. Lyra looked at her hands. The light that struck her armor did not reflect. It vanished. She felt a pull deep within, a tide dragging her inward. Valen stepped closer. Lyra Vane, he said, and his voice was almost gentle. Tell me what you found aboard the Penance of Virtue. Her throat tightened. She had not spoken since birth. Her voice was a myth even to herself. Yet, something in her rebelled against the silence. She wanted to answer, not with gesture but with sound. Her lips parted, breath trembling. And then it came. A sound low and hollow, like the first tremor of a collapsing cathedral. Not speech, not human. The custodians drew their weapons at once, the air vibrating with psychic recoil that their armor could barely resist. Valen raised a hand, halting them. Listen, he said. The sound continued, not from her mouth now, but from the air around her. It was everywhere and nowhere, the echo of an echo, vast and mournful. Through it came a whisper, faint as a dying prayer. I endure through silence. The custodians fell to one knee, faces stricken with awe or terror. Valen alone remained standing, though his eyes glistened with disbelief. That voice, he murmured. I've heard it once before, in the throne hall itself. The light around Lyra dimmed to nothing. Her vision blurred until all that remained was shadow and pulse. Within that darkness, she saw the golden throne as if through a veil of glass, the Emperor's form motionless, the machinery screaming with unseen strain. The air between them vibrated, alive with invisible static. And for the briefest instant she thought he turned his gaze toward her. Not the gaze of a god, but of something vast and weary, sustained by suffering beyond comprehension. When the vision broke, she was on the ground. Valen stood over her, his expression unreadable. "Whatever you have become," he said softly, "you are closer to him than any of us dare be." Lyra's lips trembled. She could not form words, not with voice, not with hands. The silence within her had grown too wide. It was no longer the Emperor's absence, it was his reflection, made flesh. And as she rose, the custodians fell back instinctively, as if standing too near her now risked dissolution. Valen did not move. He only whispered, "What did he show you?" Lyra lifted her eyes to the distant vaults above. When she finally gestured, her hands moved slowly, deliberately. "He showed me nothing." She paused. Her next motion was barely perceptible. "And everything." Valen bowed his head. "Then the galaxy will tremble." He turned to the others. "She is no longer to be confined. Her presence is required elsewhere, where the Emperor's silence grows thin." And so Lyra left the palace once more, though she no longer knew if she did so by choice or decree. The custodians watched her go in silence, and even Seraphine Vorn did not try to stop her. Perhaps they feared her. Perhaps they understood. As the gates closed behind her, Lyra looked back one final time. The Imperial Palace loomed like a dying sun, its glow dimmer than she remembered. And for the first time she wondered if the Emperor truly endured. Or if only his echo remained, wandering the galaxy in bodies like hers. The ship they gave her was small, austere, stripped of all decoration. It bore no sigils, no banners, no name, only a registry code erased from Imperial record before she even left orbit. Its engines murmured faintly, its corridors empty but for her and a single servitor whose mind had long since rusted into obedience. She preferred it that way. The silence here was clean, honest, the kind that did not demand worship or fear. Her orders were simple, though unreadable in their purpose: to travel to the edge of the segmentum solar and investigate a series of lost astropathic transmissions. But Lyra knew that wasn't the truth. It was exile disguised as duty. She could still feel the unease in the eyes of the custodians, the way even Valen's presence had wavered when he looked upon her. She was not sister nor soldier now. She was an aberration sent into the dark. For days, she moved through the void alone, guided by flickering coordinates that led her toward the galactic rim. Through the observation glass, she watched the stars thin, their light paling against the encroaching black. She had seen the void 1,000 times before, but now it seemed different, deeper somehow, alive with unseen movement. When she closed her eyes, she could sense it like the faint pulse of distant thunder, not sound, not sight, a vibration in the marrow of reality. She began to dream again. In her dreams, she stood upon a vast plain of ash beneath a sun that never rose. The horizon burned with faint auroras, and in the distance something vast moved. Not walking, not flying, but shifting through the air like a wound in the world. When it came closer, she saw it was robed in light and shadow, its face veiled by gold, its voice filled the sky though its lips never moved. "Do you hear me now?" When she awoke, her pulse was unsteady. The servitor had stopped mid-motion, frozen by her field. Even the hum of the ship's engine seemed muted, as if afraid to intrude. She whispered the only words she could remember from the dream, though her voice came out broken, raw from disuse. "I hear you." The moment she spoke, the lights flickered. For an instant, the observation window showed not the star field, but a sea of shifting faces, countless and translucent, all turning toward her in silent awe. Then it was gone. The stars returned, innocent and cold. Lyra stood there for a long time, one hand pressed against the glass. Somewhere beyond the reach of her senses, something had listened. By the fourth day, she reached the coordinates, an unmarked system orbiting a dying star. The world that awaited her was barren, its surface fractured and dry, its atmosphere thin but breathable. Yet from orbit, she could see faint lights moving across its equator, structures of impossible geometry, alive with the faint shimmer of energy fields that made her skin prickle. When she descended, the air greeted her with silence deeper than any she had ever known. No wind, no static, no pulse. It was not absence, but negation. The light of her shuttle dimmed as if the planet itself consumed illumination. Even her own null field seemed subdued, swallowed by something older. The ruins were not imperial. Their architecture was too fluid, too exact, alien, but not the crude barbarism of the orcs or the necrotic precision of the necrons. These structures breathed. She walked through corridors of stone that pulsed faintly beneath her boots, as though alive with memory. Along the walls were carvings, spirals and sigils that twisted when viewed too long, symbols that seemed to shift between meaning and nothingness. At the heart of the ruin stood a chamber vast and circular. In its center rose a monolith carved from black crystal, its surface flawless except for a single hairline fracture. As Lyra approached, she felt her heartbeat slow, her breath growing shallow. The fracture began to glow with faint gold, light bleeding outward in veins of brilliance that traced along the floor like rivers of starlight. She should have turned back, but she could not. When her hand brushed the monolith, the world folded inward. In that instant, every sense inverted. Silence became sound, light became shadow, and time dissolved into something that could only be described as knowing. She was no longer standing in the ruin but within the monolith itself, her body weightless, her mind pulled through an endless stream of images. She saw the galaxy from above, burning, screaming, millions of worlds crying out for salvation that would never come. She saw the Emperor upon his throne, his eyes unblinking as the web of souls around him dimmed one by one. And beyond even that, she saw herself, 1,000 Lyras walking across 1,000 worlds, each identical, each alone, each carrying the same void within. Some stood before custodians, some burned at the stake, some vanished into the warp, all of them silent, all of them the same reflection. The vision shattered like glass. She fell to her knees in the dust, gasping, the monolith's glow fading back into darkness. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, alive, humming with unseen thought. She realized then that the planet itself was not dead, it was listening. Her vox crackled suddenly, though she had left it inactive. Through the static came a voice, low, calm, and undeniably human. "Lyra Vane," it said. "You should not have come here." She froze. "Valen?" she whispered. But it was not his voice. It carried something older, deeper, a tone that seemed to vibrate the bones of the planet. "You are not meant to hear," it continued. "You are meant to be heard through." The transmission died. Lyra stood alone in the ruins, her pulse echoing against the silence. Above her, the dying sun flickered once, then dimmed, its light swallowed whole by the void. And she understood. The silence was not spreading from her, it was being called to her. Across the Imperium, wherever the Astronomicon flickered, wherever the Emperor's light waned, that same silence gathered, drawn by her presence like moths to a flame that burned without heat. She was no longer merely his servant. She was his resonance, his echo, the reflection of the divine that had forgotten how to speak. And in the dark between stars, the galaxy began to listen. Night fell without warning on that nameless world, a darkness so complete that it seemed to swallow the concept of sight itself. The air thickened with the density of meaning, heavy and still. Lyra stood at the base of the monolith, her breath misting in a cold that had no temperature. She should have felt fear, but fear belonged to those who still had a soul untouched by the void. What she felt instead was recognition, as if she had been walking toward this place all her life, unknowingly guided by an invisible thread that now pulsed beneath her skin. She waited. The silence deepened, and within it came faint movement. Shadows gathered around the edges of the chamber, coalescing into forms not entirely physical, figures of shimmering distortion, shaped like women in armor, heads bowed, hands folded. They were the sisters. Her sisters. Or rather, what remained of them. They flickered like memories caught between existence and absence, their faces lost to the light that tried and failed to cling to them. One stepped forward. Her features were impossible to distinguish, but her posture was familiar, proud, precise, the bearing of one who had once commanded. When she lifted her hand, Lyra understood without gesture or word. "We are the silence that came before the word," the figure said, her voice emerging not through sound but thought. "We were his first failure and his last mercy." Lyra reached toward her. "What am I becoming?" The answer came not as speech but as sensation, the weight of eternity pressing against her shoulders. "You are what he cannot be," the voice murmured. "You are the part of him that listens." The phantoms began to fade, their forms scattering into motes of dust that drifted upward and vanished into the dark. The monolith pulsed once more, faintly this time, its glow rhythmic like a heartbeat. The fracture at its center widened slightly, revealing a hollow interior that glimmered with light too pale to be starlight. Without hesitation, Lyra stepped inside. The interior was vast beyond reason, a cathedral of mirrors suspended in nothing. Each reflection showed a different moment, her as a child on the Black Ship, her as a novice on Ophelion 9, her striking down the Psyker, her watching Valen in silence. But there were other reflections too, lives she had never lived. A Lyra standing on a field of snow beside the broken remains of a Titan. A Lyra leading an army of sisters into a burning Hive city. A Lyra kneeling before the golden throne, her hands clasped as if in prayer while her eyes bled light. The mirrors trembled, and from their depths emerged whispers, hundreds, thousands, a chorus of the voiceless. Some wept, some laughed, some prayed. Their words blended together until they became one voice, vast and terrible. "We are you, you are us." The echo does not end, it only changes form. Lyra pressed her hands over her ears, but it was useless. The sound was inside her, blooming from within her skull. The mirrors began to crack, fragments breaking free and floating through the air like shards of frozen light. Each one carried an image, a dying world, a burning sun, a child born without sound. The echo of her existence rippled outward, infinite. Then, from among the chaos, came another sound. Steady, measured, unmistakably real. Footsteps. Valen Kor stepped into the chamber, his golden armor casting reflections in every broken mirror. He moved slowly, reverently, as though walking through the ruins of a temple. "So it is true. he said quietly. The silence has found its voice. Lyra stared at him, her vision fractured by the shifting glass. "Why are you here?" she asked. Though she barely recognized her own voice, it was softer now, resonant, like sound passing through water. "The custodians follow the Emperor's light," he said. "But his light fades, and where it fades, the void grows. I was sent to witness what becomes of his silence." He came closer, stopping just beyond arm's reach. The mirrors pulsed faintly with his reflection. "Tell me, Lyra, does he still endure?" She wanted to answer, but the truth felt too large for words. She looked into one of the mirrors instead. In it, she saw the Emperor seated upon his throne, his body unmoving, his soul stretched across the Astronomicon like a net holding back the night. Yet around him, in the spaces between light, she saw shapes, faint outlines of women in armor, walking unseen, their faces turned away. "He endures through us," she said at last, through the silence he left behind. Valen bowed his head. "Then the galaxy still has hope." Lyra shook her head slowly. "No, hope is sound. What remains is endurance." The chamber shuddered. The fracture in the monolith split wider, light flooding outward in a torrent that tore through the air like wind. The mirrors dissolved into brilliance, and in that instant Lyra understood. The silence was not merely the absence of the warp. It was its opposite, a force that existed outside creation, older than stars, drawn now to the Emperor's failing beacon like gravity itself. It was not consuming, it was returning. She turned to Valen, who stood unmoving within the storm of light. His armor glowed, the golden surface reflecting her outline. "Go," she said. "Tell them what you saw. Tell them the silence is coming." He hesitated. "And you?" Lyra looked back toward the heart of the monolith, where the light pulsed like a living sun. "I must listen." Valen wanted to speak, to argue, but words failed. He gave a final nod, a warrior's bow, and stepped back through the widening fracture. The light swallowed him, then dimmed. Lyra stood alone in the heart of the echo. Around her, the light softened, becoming translucent, serene. She closed her eyes, feeling the silence settle through her like falling snow. There were no voices now, no visions, no fear. Only the steady rhythm of the void's breath. Somewhere far above, on Terra, the Astronomicon flickered once. The navigators felt it as a brief loss of direction, a trembling in the infinite night. They whispered prayers, terrified that the Emperor's light had faltered. But the light returned, not brighter, not weaker, only different. Softer, colder, balanced. In the chamber of the monolith, Lyra smiled faintly. For the first time in her life, she felt peace, not the stillness of suppression, but the harmony of understanding. The silence had never been a curse. It had always been a message waiting to be heard. The monolith pulsed one last time, and the world fell quiet. Far away, in the echoing vaults of the Golden Throne, a single machine spirit emitted a sound that had not been heard in 10,000 years. It sighed. The galaxy had changed while Lyra slept within the monolith, though none could say how long she had remained there. When her eyes opened again, the world around her was silent still, but different, clean, cold, stripped bare. The monolith had cracked apart, its once flawless surface reduced to fragments that floated weightlessly in the thin air. The sun above was little more than a coal on the edge of extinction, and the stars beyond it pulsed in unnatural rhythm, as though answering a call that only the void could hear. She rose slowly, her armor flaking like old parchment, every plate humming faintly with new energy. The silence no longer pressed on her from without. It flowed from her instead, gentle but absolute. When she stepped forward, the dust shifted not because of her weight, but because of recognition. The world itself bent toward her like a penitent. She began to walk. Each step left behind faint impressions of light that faded almost instantly, traces of a presence that was not entirely physical. The ruins around her were still alive, not in movement, but in memory. She could feel the remnants of the sisters who had appeared to her, lingering as motes of awareness in the dust. They did not speak now. They simply were, watching, waiting. At the horizon, the air shimmered. A structure waited there, dark and massive, too distant to perceive clearly. Something about it felt familiar, not by sight, but by rhythm. Its pulse matched her own. Drawn to it by instinct, she began the long journey across the dead plain. Hours or days passed. Time had become meaningless. She did not eat, did not rest, did not breathe as mortals did. Her existence was sustained by something purer, the silence itself, coursing through her veins like frozen fire. When she reached the base of the structure, she understood what she had seen from afar. It was not a building, nor a fortress. It was a tomb. Carved into the rock were colossal figures, their forms eroded but unmistakable. Sisters of silence, kneeling in perpetual vigil. Their visors were cracked, their hands raised in the gesture of eternal oath. Between them, an archway led into darkness so profound that even her field could not consume it. Above the arch, a single inscription remained legible, not written in High Gothic, but in the ancient dialect of Terra's pre-imperial age. She did not need translation. She understood it instinctively. Here waits the sound that will end the silence. She stepped through. The air inside was cold and sweet, filled with the faint metallic tang of stasis. Her boots echoed softly at first, then fell silent as she descended deeper. The walls were etched with text, prayers, names, invocations of the Emperor written in thousands of hands. But as she read, she realized something impossible. The inscriptions grew newer as she went deeper. Recent, some marked with dates that had not yet come to pass. At the base of the tomb, she found a single chamber, illuminated by pale fire. In its center stood a sarcophagus of gold and glass, suspended above the floor by invisible force. Inside, surrounded by light, lay a woman in silver armor. Her face was unmasked, her features tranquil. Lyra approached and saw her own reflection in that face. Not metaphor, not resemblance. It was herself. The figure within the sarcophagus opened her eyes. Lyra stumbled back, her breath catching. The woman inside regarded her calmly, her gaze ancient and knowing. When she spoke, her voice was soft but resonant, vibrating through the air and the bone. "You've come far," she said, "further than you were meant to." Lyra found her voice rough and quiet. "What are you?" The reflection smiled faintly. "What you will become, or what you already are, depending on how you measure time. The Emperor's silence is not linear, it folds, it repeats, it learns through its echoes." "I don't understand." "You do." The reflection's tone held no accusation, only certainty. "When you touched the monolith, you became a conduit, not of faith, but of balance. The void speaks through you now, and through every silence that ever was. I am its memory, preserved until you were ready to listen." Lyra stepped closer. The light from the sarcophagus touched her armor, and for the first time she saw it clearly. The faint golden veins running through the ceramite, the same light she had seen in the Emperor's gaze. "Is this immortality?" she asked. The reflection's eyes softened. "No, this is remembrance. Immortality belongs to those who cannot let go. You were never meant to live forever. You were meant to return." Lyra reached out, placing her hand upon the glass. The surface was cool, but she felt warmth radiating beneath it, a heartbeat that matched her own. The reflection raised her hand to meet it, their palms separated by only the thin veil of the barrier. "What happens now?" Lyra whispered. The answer came as light. The sarcophagus dissolved, scattering into 1,000 motes that drifted upward like dust illuminated by dawn. The reflection stepped forward, merging with her, passing through her like breath. For an instant, Lyra saw everything: the black ships, the sisterhood, the endless wars, the burning of worlds, the Emperor's broken throne, and through it all, the same pulse. The silence, eternal and unending. When the light faded, she stood alone once more. But she was not the same. Her armor had changed. The silver deepened to shadow, the gold veins glowing faintly with internal luminescence. Her visor reformed itself into a smooth surface, featureless and calm. She lifted her gauntlet and felt power hum beneath her skin, but it was not violence. It was peace, the peace of nothing left to lose. The tomb began to tremble. The inscriptions along the walls glowed briefly, then crumbled into dust. Lyra turned toward the archway as the world above began to fracture. The silence had reached its crescendo. She stepped out into the dying light of the star, her every motion slow, deliberate, sacred. Above her, the heavens rippled as though awakening from a long dream. The Astronomican's light reached her even here, flickering, uncertain, and for the first time, she felt it respond. Not as command, but as acknowledgement. Across the galaxy, psychers cried out in unison. For a heartbeat, their torment ceased, their minds filled with a single image. A woman in black and gold, standing beneath a dead sun, her eyes bright with the reflection of eternity. She raised her hand, and for one brief, impossible moment, the Emperor's silence sang. The sound that wasn't sound spread like light through water, rippling across the fabric of the galaxy. It reached every mind that had ever strained toward the Astronomican's beam: psychers, navigators, astropaths, and even those too broken to name what they felt. To the untrained, it came as peace; to the faithful, revelation; to the cursed, unbearable grace. For the first time in 10,000 years, the scream of the warp softened, its tides briefly calm beneath a stillness that felt older than creation itself. Lyra felt it move through her, not outward, but inward, the universe collapsing toward the center of her being, as if she were the echo around which all silence orbited. She saw again the faces of those she had known and erased: Ilyane's soft defiance, Valen's unreadable calm, Seraphine's hard devotion. They flickered through her memory not as ghosts, but as syllables in a language only the void could speak. Each life she had touched, each silence she had wrought, had been part of a greater word being spoken through her. She turned her gaze upward. The dying sun hung in the sky like a wounded eye, its corona twisting with faint gold. Beneath its fading glow, she could sense the threads of unseen watchers. Perhaps it was the Imperium, tracking the anomaly. Perhaps it was something older, deeper, drawn to the wound she represented. It didn't matter. The silence was no longer a tool of man or God or empire. It was a truth, ancient and self-sustaining, carried forward in her pulse. Her comm bead crackled. A voice whispered through the static. "Lyra Vane, by decree of the High Custodian, you are ordered to return to Terra for containment and examination." Valen. Even distorted by distance and fear, she recognized his voice. For a moment, she almost smiled. "Containment," she murmured, tasting the word. It sounded hollow, like a prayer to a god that no longer listened. The vox crackled again. "Lyra, answer me. The palace feels your resonance. The throne's engines falter when you breathe. The Emperor himself trembles." She closed her eyes. "Then he hears me," she said softly. There was silence. Then, "Don't do this." She could have told him it wasn't her choice, that choice itself had become meaningless since the monolith. She could have told him she didn't know what this even was, apocalypse, renewal, or something between. But words had become too fragile for truth. Instead, she looked to the horizon, where the planet's surface cracked and began to rise, fragments of stone lifting into the air as if gravity had remembered it was only faith in disguise. The silence deepened. Through it, she heard the whisper again. The one that had followed her since Ophelion 9, the voice that had never truly left. "Remember." She spoke aloud, though no one could hear her. "I do." Then the world broke. The crust of the planet split open in concentric rings, light pouring from the fissures like liquid dawn. The ruins disintegrated, the tomb collapsed, and the monolith's remains rose into the sky, suspended in the air like shards of black glass. Lyra stood at the center of it all, her figure outlined against the rising light. She raised her hand, and the fragments responded, aligning themselves into new constellations, forming symbols too vast for mortal comprehension. Across the Imperium, the Astronomicon flickered. Astropaths screamed and fell silent. Some wept in joy, others tore out their eyes to escape the sight. The Adeptus Mechanicus recorded anomalies they could not explain. Momentary reversals in the flow of data through their noospheric networks, machine spirits that prayed instead of calculating. And on Terra, deep within the throne hall, the custodians felt it too. The light surrounding the Emperor dimmed to near darkness, then flared again, steadier this time, but altered. For a heartbeat, his golden aura was tinged with silver. The tech priests wailed. The choir masters of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica fell to their knees. The High Lords gathered, uncertain whether to rejoice or despair. In the midst of this cosmic tremor, Lyra saw Valen's face once more, not through vox or vision, but through the silence itself. He was standing in the throne hall, head bowed, his halberd lowered. She could see the golden light playing across his armor, hear the faint rhythm of his breath even from a galaxy away. His lips moved. "What have you become?" She answered without sound. What he always was. The words carried across the void not as speech but as understanding. Volin's eyes widened. Around him, the other custodians faltered, struck by the sudden weight of presence filling the chamber. It was not the Emperor's gaze that pressed upon them now. It was hers. Lyra extended her hand, and across the light years, the Emperor's throne trembled. The endless mechanisms that sustained his life, the golden coils, the soul engines, the pylons of psychic amplification, all vibrated in resonance with her pulse. For the first time in millennia, the Emperor stirred. His fingers twitched, imperceptible to most, but to those who had waited for eternity, it was enough to shatter every certainty they had clung to. The Astronomicon steadied. Its beam burned, brighter, but the light that emerged was different. Not the blinding gold of divine tyranny, but a cooler radiance, white-edged in shadow, balanced, unyielding. The navigators who beheld it described it in their logs as the calm before dawn. The ecclesiarchy, in their terror, called it heresy of the pale light. Lyra felt none of their fear, only stillness. The silence was no longer hers to carry. It had always belonged to the galaxy itself, to the stars, the dead, the forgotten prayers of those who had served and suffered without reply. She had only been its vessel. Now, The vessel overflowed. She sank to her knees as the light rose higher, her armor dissolving into luminescent dust that scattered like pollen in the air. Her hands, her face, her form all began to fade. But as her body dissolved, her awareness widened. She could feel every star's heartbeat, every whisper of a dying world, every plea uttered in the dark. And then, at the edge of her fading perception, she heard one last voice. Familiar, steady, human. Valen's. "Lyra," he whispered, "don't leave us in silence." Her answer came from everywhere at once, gentle and absolute. You were never alone in it. The light consumed her. The world vanished. And yet, somewhere deep within the echo, something continued to breathe. For a moment there was no time, no space, only silence. Not the suffocating quiet of absence, but the serene stillness of completion, the pause between two heartbeats of creation itself. From that stillness came awareness, vast and unanchored. Lyra no longer saw through eyes or thought through flesh. She was the silence now, diffused across the galaxy like mist upon glass. Every world where men prayed and died, every ship lost between stars, every whispered plea to the Emperor that had vanished unanswered. She felt them all. Their words passed through her as ripples through water, and for the first time they did not vanish into void, they resonated. On holy Terra, the golden throne pulsed with unfamiliar rhythm. The custodians knelt in confusion as machine spirits sang hymns no one had programmed. The choir of the Astronomicon screamed in unity, not from pain, but revelation, their voices blending into a tone that filled the entire palace with trembling light. The Emperor remained motionless, but the aura that surrounded him had changed. It no longer burned with the harsh gold of dominion, but with a steady, dim radiance, a balance between day and dusk. The priests who witnessed it fell to their knees and wept, not knowing whether to rejoice or despair. Among them, Valen Kor stood still. His armor's surface reflected the pale light in gentle waves. He could feel her presence, not near, but everywhere. It whispered through the very air, through the metal of the walls, through his pulse. Her name came to him unspoken. Lyra Vane, the woman who had carried silence into the heart of the Emperor and made it listen. He turned toward the throne and whispered, "If you hear her, then hear us too." The light flickered, as if in answer. Across the galaxy, the change spread unseen. On a world consumed by war, an Imperial Guard officer raised his head mid-battle and felt for the first time a moment of peace. On a dying black ship, the Psychers bound in chains ceased their endless screaming, their minds suddenly soothed by a calm that felt like home. On the void fronts, navigators wept as the Astronomicon steadied, its song shifting to a gentler frequency that no longer clawed at the soul, but guided it like a quiet hand. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica called it an anomaly. The Ecclesiarchy called it blasphemy. But among the sisterhood, the few who still remembered her name whispered that it was grace. The daughters without voice began to dream again, not of sound but of understanding. And somewhere, beyond the reach of light or warp, in the quiet heart of what remained of Lyra Vane, thought returned, not in words, but in awareness. She drifted through the void like dust through sunlight, her consciousness diffuse, infinite. Yet even in that vastness, a shape began to coalesce. Not human, but remembered. She saw herself as she once had been, kneeling in the cloisters of Ophelion 9, surrounded by sisters in silent prayer. She saw the faces of those she had killed and those she had saved, their boundaries dissolving until they became one endless chorus of presence. The silence spoke to her then, though its voice was her own. "You have listened long enough, now be still." And she understood. To speak was to disturb the order of eternity. To listen was to become part of it. The Emperor's silence had never been punishment nor indifference. It was endurance, the refusal to vanish even when words failed. The Imperium had mistaken it for absence, but Lyra saw the truth. He endured through every unspoken prayer, every moment of sacrifice unseen, every death met without witness. The quiet had never been empty, it had always been full of them. She felt the pull of dissolution, gentle and final. Yet before she faded completely, she sent one last impulse through the web of silence that now stretched across creation. It was not command or revelation, but memory, a single thought cast into the abyss. Remember me not as the end, but as the listening between prayers. That thought traveled faster than light, weaving itself into the pulse of the Astronomicon, into the breath of the Emperor, into the dreams of all who knelt beneath his gaze. And as it passed, the universe shivered, not in fear, but in recognition. On Terra, Valen stood before the throne, his head bowed. He felt the echo pass through him, the faint touch of something both immense and tender. He closed his eyes and whispered a name that was never recorded, never spoken again. For a moment, he thought he heard a reply, the faintest breath across the vast chamber, as if the throne itself exhaled. Outside, dawn broke across the palace walls. The light was softer now, gentler, as though filtered through the memory of something long forgotten. The pilgrims who saw it wept, believing it a sign of renewal. The ecclesiarch declared it a miracle. The custodian said nothing. They simply watched as the sunlight crept through the halls and touched the edge of the throne, glinting against the motionless figure seated upon it. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Emperor's lips parted. Not in speech, but in breath. The faintest sigh escaped him, so soft that only the silence could hear. And somewhere in the dark between stars where light had never reached, that breath became a whisper that would never end. The last prayer of the voiceless, the promise that silence endures,